Thank you. And my PowerPoint, let's get that going. Sharing my screen, sharing to that screen. And okay, Conquering Dyslexia, chapters 4 and 5. And welcome again to everybody. We've got 2 chapters to cover tonight. That's a lot. So without further ado, we'll just, I'll let my co-hosts weigh in to talk about the co-hosts and sponsors and our important information for the evening.
Okay, I will take that on. My name is Mary Newton. I'm the president of the Reading League Wisconsin, and I have Katie Kasabowski joining me as another co-host this evening, and Katie is the lead for Decoding Dyslexia Wisconsin. So it's exciting for us to work together and also to work with the other states. So we have the Reading League chapter from Pennsylvania and the Decoding Dyslexia chapter from Pennsylvania, plus their International Dyslexia Association branch. And we have Reed Washington out in Jan's territory. So all of us have kind of been working together on this with Jan. And so it's just exciting to work together and see so many people respond to this. So you can see from our schedule here, we're on chapters 4 and 5 tonight. Those are the final 2 chapters in the book. And for those of you who have been here the entire time, what I really appreciate is a lot of times people ask if we can just speak, let's get to the how and how we teach and what we teach. And this is, I think, really helpful, having been through the introductory material for chapters 1 through 3, talking about characteristics of dyslexia and what it looks like and how we diagnose it. So I think this, looking at chapters 4 and 5 now, they'll make a lot more sense than they would if we had just eliminated those earlier chapters. So we're really grateful to Jan for doing this for us. I want to point out that we do have this Google Doc. It's in the chat. There's a Zoom, there's a Google form in there. And we would appreciate it if everybody would fill out the Google form. We get some information on who's here. But if you want a certificate of attendance, you have to fill out the Google form. It's the only way we know who's here. And speaking as the person who fills out those certificates, and some of them will invariably bounce back, please double check your email address when you enter it into the Google Doc, because if we don't have the right email address, it's going to bounce back to us. And I do try to go online and do some sleuthing to get your certificate to you, but it's easier if it just goes out as planned. So when we're going along tonight, if you have questions, please put them in the, are we going to use chat box, or are we going to use? Chat box is fine. It just gives us one place to check. So you put your questions there. We're going to stop about halfway through after Jan gets done with chapter 4 and answer some questions there, and then we'll answer some more at the end. And just remember, if we don't get to all of the questions tonight, we do have the wrap-up session. And I hope that if you enjoy tonight, that you'll join Katie and me next week on Tuesday night at the same time. We will be having a discussion of chapters 4 and 5 in a small group format, and that's aimed toward parents. And then we'll be having another one on Thursday at the same time, aimed toward educators. But if you can't come to your assigned group, feel free to come to the other one. It's not a strict division of people for those groups. So we hope that you will join us next week, and then 2 weeks from tonight for Jan's final wrap-up session. Okay, I think that does it for me, Jan. So
all right. Thank you, Mary. Yeah, thanks very much. And I did see some questions from people. Katie, I think you're responding that people who logged in after the handouts got posted, need those reposted. So thank you for doing that. Um, so yes, we're doing a book study of my book, Conquering Dyslexia, and we are at 4 and 5 chapters tonight. Yes, finally getting around to talking about teaching, but I appreciate what you said, Mary, about laying that foundation as we did in the book, What is Dyslexia, and Assessing Dyslexia. Last week was the assessment conversation around chapter 3, and I started that by saying that this was a challenging topic, and we've got another challenging topic here tonight, partly for some of the same reasons that chapter 3 was a little bit challenging, that there's a lot of feelings and opinions, and a lot of people bring a lot of experience to both assessment and teaching, and and that can be hard to hear something that may not be totally aligned with the way you've been doing things and the things that have been working. The other challenge that I want to acknowledge is I'm trying to cover two chapters tonight, so that makes it challenging. And as Mary said, I'm going to just keep going through until I've wrapped up what I want to say about chapter 4, and then we'll finish with a discussion of chapter 5, both very rich chapters. Yeah, I guess another challenge is the fact that when we're talking about teaching and covering it in two relatively short chapters, there's just so much more that we could talk about. Teaching children to read is many books in itself, and teaching children with dyslexia to read. So these are our highlights and big ideas for sure. Um, I have said from the beginning, and if you've read the book, you've picked up on this certainly, that what I wrote about in the book did not just come out of my head at all. That couldn't possibly be true. So when I'm talking about these two chapters specifically, I owe a great deal of debt and want to pay homage and honor to many of the folks that contributed to my understanding of what good instruction is in general and good instruction for dyslexia. So as you scan over this list, I'm sure you're seeing some names of people I hope that you too hold in very high regard and have studied their work and learned from them, and many more that didn't actually appear on this list. So the chapters are How to Teach and What to Teach, chapter 4 on the procedural issues. And coming back over and over again, as we do in the book, that it's the powerful interventions. There's no other magic. We can't really start too early, but it is those powerful interventions that can help us overcome dyslexia. That doesn't mean it goes away. It doesn't mean that the brain isn't a dyslexic brain, but we can build those successful neural pathways so that and if we do it early enough, we can prevent it from ever becoming a factor. Children are born with dyslexia. We can't prevent that yet. I mean, who knows what will come from genetic research and that in the future, but we can prevent it from becoming a factor in their lives. That powerful interventions, the instruction. Um, Mark Seidenberg, I've referred to him and do refer to him throughout the book, so helpful in our understanding about how the brain becomes a reading brain. And he and many other researchers have clearly identified that reading is not learned in the same way we learn to talk. Last week in the assessment chapter discussion, I talked about what reading is. And I wanted to remind all of you that those first two sessions were recorded, and you can access those recordings if you want to revisit them or didn't get to see them in the first place at the Read Washington website, readwa.org. So when we talk about reading, talk about it in the book around Scarborough's rope, this lovely colored rendition of the rope that we do have in two places in the book, representing that idea that the outcome of reading or reading comprehension is the product of these two larger groups. In the simple view of reading, that equation that's written at the top, reading comprehension, is the outcome of language comprehension times Decoding in Scarborough's Rope talked discussing language comprehension and word recognition as the two major components that contribute to that outcome of reading comprehension. So that's what we think reading is, what we know reading to be and understand reading. When we're talking about how do we teach reading, we keep all of that in mind, but with heightened focus for our children with dyslexia around word recognition, because that is where their challenges are. Those powerful interventions, what we know that we should do, and it's really an ethical decision to make sure that we are using the most effective reading methods and providing that instruction to all children. Now, my book and our discussion here tonight are those children with dyslexia, but as if you've read the chapters in the book or read the research of many, many others, what we do know is that the most effective instruction is valuable to all readers along the continuum of ability. But I agree with the researchers that I've cited here, my Australian colleagues, that it really is an ethical consideration to do that, and prudent, because it's so much easier to prevent challenges than it is to remediate it. But when we talk about the most effective reading methods, first of all, how do we know what's the most effective? Well, it's because of research, decades of research now, close to 50 years of laying on evidence on top of more and more evidence um, as our research methodologies have increased in sophistication, as the technology that we can use to assess what's going on. So I've put just a few citations here. There are many more in the book, and many that I didn't even cite in the book, just a vast amount of compelling and a convergence of evidence. It's not any longer, people say you can prove anything with research. I used to hear that in the early days of my career. And it's just no longer true. We have a convergence. What we're not finding any longer that one study says this and then one study says that. Not if they're well designed, thoughtful, well executed research studies. What we're finding is this is true, and then we learn, yes, that's true, and then this is true, and this, and it just keeps building our knowledge about what those most effective methods are. And the components of those most effective methods are summarized by many people with these components, that they are comprehensive, systematic, explicit, intensive, and include multimodality instruction. And I'm going to say this about the most effective reading methods. I'm going to add now diagnostic instruction to this list. I did not do that in the book. And this is just to acknowledge to myself and to you that my thinking continues to evolve and grow as I read the work of other people, I attend trainings, I have more opportunity to think about things. And all of you know, who have ever committed anything to print, from an email to the books or master's thesis or doctoral dissertations that you, or articles that you've written. Once it's in print, there's always this, oh, I wish I had said this differently. I wish I could have said it differently. If I get a chance to write this book again, I'm going to include the component of diagnostic teaching in what I call in the book structured literacy, which is covered in the book. If you're following along on these things on pages 101 to 114, I do talk about diagnostic teaching, or what I understand to be diagnostic teaching, in a slightly different way. I talk about that in terms of progress monitoring, collecting and using that data and modifying the instruction as we're teaching children. So I do talk about it. I will just in the future relabel that as a component of structured literacy and call that diagnostic teaching. So what do we mean by these components? Comprehensive it is covering all the essential standards, the foundational components of reading, plus the advanced skills and knowledge. And that's really important because one of the criticisms that the science of reading gets, and the general reading wars are often focused on this faulty, totally false notion that those of us who take a scientific approach to reading instruction only care about phonics. Have you heard that one? Which is just bizarre and not true. And I always want people to say, show me one place where somebody says the only thing we need to be thinking about for our students is phonics. Well, first of all, if we know anything about phonics and how it works, we know that you have to have language and you have to have phonemic awareness and proficiency to make sense of phonics. And who cares about phonics if we don't have vocabulary and reading comprehension, and we can't use it if we don't have fluency. So it's not just those foundational components, certainly not just phonics. That would be just ridiculous, but all the foundational components of reading, plus those advanced skills and knowledge, because we want our students, as demonstrated in Scarborough's Road, to keep reading and increasing their knowledge and their ability to read, understand, and comprehend anything they want to. So good structured literacy is comprehensive. It's also systematic, which we cover in a couple of pages in the book, essentially meaning a carefully designed scope and sequence. I always think of systematic instruction as the job of the publisher or the author of the curriculum. That needs to be done behind the scenes. That's all the work of laying out the program itself. I do cite other people's work for that, for systematic instruction. Explicit is how we deliver the instruction. This comprehensive and systematically designed instruction, we deliver it in structured literacy with optimal effects by delivering with clarity and intention, and that gradual release of responsibility from I show you what I want you to do, we do it together until you're ready to try it on your own, and then you do it as a student by yourself. I check and see how you're doing, and that's where the diagnostic teaching comes in. At the you do step, if you're needing more assistance, we can go back to the I do, I'll show you, we do it together. And then this notion of intensity, talking about that in a couple of pages. Oh yes, the scripts. Explicit instruction is often thought of synonymously with scripted instruction. And on page 108, there's a little discussion there by someone who contributed the idea that explicit instruction often is written as scripted instruction, but scripts alone don't guarantee that it is systematic and will be delivered explicitly. So there's a discussion about that. Intensive instruction, active engagement and use of small groups, and structured literacy often includes that multimodality, which I'll talk about next. The small group instruction, I love these pictures of different classrooms that my colleagues and I have worked with. This is the I do and we do, generally small group instruction. And in the real world, small groups can vary in size, but we increase the intensity and the effectiveness of instruction by keeping it as small as possible. And then the you do is a child working independently to apply what has been learned. Increasingly, there's evidence from research and certainly in my practice of the wisdom of including another step after the I do and we do to a step of collaborative practice, not just the teacher and the student. My 10 years in Texas allows me, I think, to use the wonderful inclusive term of y'all do. So this is the kind of instruction I really think is optimal, an I do, we do opportunity with followed by collaborative work by children and then the you do step. And for those of you who work with older children, I know many of the folks attending these sessions work with our younger beginning readers, but the need for support for our children with dyslexia goes across the grades and on into college and beyond. And small group and collaborative practice is appropriate across all grade levels from early pre-K through high school and college and beyond. We've successfully used both small group and collaborative instruction at graduate university level, as well as at the early stages with our very young children. And then the multimodality, which all of these are discussed over a couple of pages, including making sure that we include all the sensory modalities and directly related to reading and writing skill development. Multimodality is a relatively new term. It's being used more often to replace a previous term of multisensory instruction, which is often associated with the Orton-Gillingham methodologies of teaching students. There's a long history to Orton-Gillingham. Their work they really were the pioneers of understanding what dyslexia really was and what the instructional needs of children with dyslexia. It was the major initial contribution to our understanding of what dyslexia was and how to teach it. Our understanding of what good instruction is has grown and evolved. And there are some aspects of Orton-Gillingham that some believe, and the research evidence from different folks, including the person I said was my touchstone for this work, which was Jack Fletcher and his colleagues, stated in their book that despite the wide acceptance and enthusiasm for Orton-Gillingham and the OG-based programs, and there are many of those, not all the studies reported them to be superior, that we want to be sure that we're looking at programs and methodologies that incorporate all of our newest and best understandings. And that is true for some of the Orton-Gillingham materials, and some may not be incorporating the best and newest science. So we want to be sure that all these pieces are included, but the importance of including multimodality at an appropriate level of intensity, and that is highlighted there, italicized, because what we do know, what the original gift of Orton and Gillingham's work was that a correct awareness that many of our children with dyslexia, because of their neurological needs, really need a lot more of practice around the hearing, the seeing, the speaking, and the writing. But the evidence, so that remains true. All children benefit from that, but children who have dyslexia benefit even more. They need that multimodality at a level of intensity quite different from neurotypical children. But what the newest research is saying is that hearing, seeing, speaking, writing is best applied in activities and practice that is directly related to pronouncing words, pronouncing phonemes, reading and speaking and writing those words. And that diagnostic component, which I define as collecting the appropriate formative data, including observation and writing samples, quiz results, all that kind of data, and then using it, very important. So I refer to that in the book as progress monitoring. And again, future editions of the book, I will incorporate that into an actual component of structured literacy. But we talked about progress monitoring a bit last time in the assessment presentation in the assessment chapters. But it's relevant here because we need to continue to collect that data and analyze where our students are making progress and where they're not, and respond to it. So I showed these graphs last time of this child. These are graphs from real children in real school situations. This little girl who was making steady expected progress, this child who exceeded the expectations for progress, this child who was not making expected progress at the beginning. The team of teachers working in this school sat down, looked at what was being provided, modified the student's instruction, and we have evidence that the new modified instruction was having effect. And then I shared this graph where same group of wonderful teachers, but a child clearly with some extraordinary needs that were not being met by what could be provided at what we might call tier 1 and tier 2. So when we're talking about diagnostic teaching, what we really need to think about is collecting and analyzing this data, but most importantly is talking about what do we do about it? What do we do? Classroom teachers, content specialists, special educators, coaches, SLPs, etc. What do we do when we see these kinds of results from our students? We need to consider modifying instruction, and then continuing to monitor, and then modify as necessary. It becomes this formative, adaptive process. So when we're talking about diagnostic teaching and modifying instruction, what are we talking about? What are the things we should consider in modifying instruction? We want to be sure that the instruction is appropriately matched to the identified needs of the students. Using a fluency intervention for a student whose real issues are at the phonemic awareness and phonics level is a bad match, even if it is good evidence-based instruction that has worked for other children. Are we using a quality program and quality instruction? That's where that comprehensive, systematic, and explicit instruction comes in. Are we using a well-designed program that is a good match for the student, and are we using it as it was designed to be used? Are we providing instruction that's of sufficient intensity for the child? Are we providing that level of differentiated, intensive, multimodality instruction that that child might need? Are we doing the instruction in a small enough group, or perhaps one-to-one? Are we seeing the student? Well, I guess that's my next point, the frequency and duration of instruction. Are we seeing the students often enough and for a long enough time? I do hear, I talk to people in schools a lot. People reach out to me and say, I'm working with a student, they're just not making progress. I'm seeing them once a week, or I'm seeing them twice a week for a few minutes at a time, and they're not making progress. That may be the issue itself. And then of course we have to have an other category, because there's always some things that can be going on in a student's life affecting them in their emotional health and wellness. All of those kinds of things can be a cause for children needing more specialized attention or some modification in any of these areas. One of the handouts tonight included for you is this checklist. It's actually a 2-page checklist of what to consider if you see that a child is not making expected progress. What are some of the things you might consider adapting for the modifying in their instruction? We have over 2 pages in the book, Nancy Young's wonderful ladder of reading, which she gave us permission to use and include in the book. And we were just thrilled to be able to do that, because this so brilliantly helps us understand application of these ideas of how to teach. So we have the 5% of children who for learning to read is somewhat effortless. Those children, when studied by researchers, are labeled proficient, precocious readers. They just seem to read with little to no instruction. Another group of children, estimated in Nancy's review of the research to be about 35%, who learn to read relatively easy with instruction of some sort, broad instruction. So that gives us about 40% of children who should do pretty well no matter what we do. Then we've got our orange band there, 40 to 50% of children who can learn to read. But it's very important to note the wording choice that Nancy uses in here, that group of children, if they're going to learn to read proficiently, that's where we're starting to talk about the code-based, explicit, systematic, carefully planned instruction. And then we have our children with dyslexia, estimated on this chart based on Nancy's review of the research to be 10 to 15%, the children who we identify as dyslexia. For them, learning to read requires, so you see the difference between the orange and the red, learning to read at all for these children require that code-based, explicit, systematic, sequential, and she uses the word diagnostic instruction, assessing, responding to that assessment, modifying instruction with many, many repetitions. So we know this to be true from all those studies that I showed you, and Nancy cites many different studies. But what we know that across the ladder, that for our children in these two groups, that structured literacy approach, that comprehensive, systematic, explicit, multimodality, intensive diagnostic instruction is essential. But interestingly, the children at the top of the ladder benefit when we use structured literacy with them. It is not just something we do really differently with the children who have dyslexia or other learning challenges. All children benefit from the use of structured literacy in a differentiated way. The children in the green are just going to need much less intensive instruction. They'll be able to move faster through that instruction. In the book on uh, page 164, we have a checklist on how teaching should be taught so that you can review how you're doing it or how the school where your students are attending, your children are attending, are they doing this kind of structured literacy instruction in a strong way. They're doing some of it. It's rather weak comments, so you can do some analysis of the programs you're doing. So this is our halfway-ish mark, how to teach reading. So this is my time to take a pause and see if there are a few questions that I might answer.
There are a few questions in here, and Katie, if you want to come online and help out with this too, that would be great. There's one person, actually, you just kind of addressed this when you were looking at Nancy Young's ladder of reading. I have a question about differentiating for students in my class who are learning to read quickly and seem bored with the whole group phonological awareness or phonics scope and sequence like foundations. Do they benefit from participating anyway for practice, or should I cease teaching the curriculum in a whole group?
That's a really, always answering about what do particular children need without knowing the children or seeing their assessments. But there are some children who have sufficiently developed phonemic awareness. We want to be sure, and this, I can hear David Kilpatrick in my ear right here, that we want to be sure that we take them to proficiency. But we need to pay attention to children who are bored and seem to have it. And there's so much to teach and so much to learn, and we certainly don't want to dampen enthusiasm. So I would pay attention to that. I can't make a strong recommendation, definitive recommendation one way or the other without knowing the children, but it would be a red flag for me. I want children to be engaged and happy and excited and learning new stuff, but we don't want to be sure that we leave them with just insufficiently deep learning. So keep an eye on that and do some assessments with those students. And yeah, if we can move them along faster, let's do that.
Uh,
We had another question from Becky. She said, children will not be given testing when they make any gain, even though they are still way below the targeted goals where I teach. What do you think of this? And then I asked for clarification.
Yeah, thank you.
Was it for a learning disability? And she said yes.
Oh, yeah. What do we do about that? I mean, that's what we need to do is empower ourselves, all of us who are educators and the parents of these children, to make sure that we know what best instruction looks like and do everything we can to share that knowledge with our classroom colleagues, that we're doing the best that we can. It's a wonderful gift to our children. We can identify their needs and give them specialized instruction, but we don't always have that opportunity, and we cannot wait. That's the real message. We need to do everything we can, and sometimes everything we can just seems so minimal and so diminished, but we don't wait for labels and we don't wait for testing. We just do what's right, and all children will benefit from that. I know that sounds so simplistic and easy to say and extremely hard to do, but let's not get the lack of an assessment, a label, in the way of us doing everything we possibly can.
So here's another question. Do you recommend intensive instruction focus on skill deficits or a preview or double dose of what they're receiving in the classroom? I guess just two different ways of providing
Yeah.
some support.
My quick answer to that would be yes, just do it. If it works better to pre-teach, that can be wonderful, but we don't always have the opportunity for that. Children sometimes benefit just as much from sort of getting an overview in their classroom and then diving a little deeper, as appropriate, from extra instruction. So I don't know of any research evidence that suggests that one way is better than the other. But double dosing as a preview, or a review, or if we can do it, both, can be very valuable to our students.
And I
I,
suppose it depends a little bit on what it is that they have in the classroom and
yeah,
whether that's really a good solid program, or if it's not, then a double dose of it isn't really going to help. So,
that's a good point too. Double dose of something that's not very valuable is not going to be beneficial to students. So
Yeah, I
that's where
got
that,
nervous when it said double dose
yeah.
because here it's double dose of things you don't want, double
Right,
dose.
right. So that takes us back to that comprehensive and systematic. What are we teaching? Are we narrowing it down to the major components of Scarborough's rope? And if there's some deficits there, let's zero in. I'm going to go ahead and go on because I know time is ticking and I want to get to chapter 5 about what to teach. And we'll hopefully have opportunity for further questions. Mark Seidenberg, again, this quote from his book, Language at the Speed of Sight, where he talks about what have we learned about how children learn to read. And I come back to this statement many, many times because I remember reading it the first time where he says, how do children learn to read? The answer is the same for all children. I just stopped in my tracks. And he went on to say, of course, there are differences that are cultural, economic, educational, that obviously affect children's progress, but what they need to learn does not change. And subsequently, my learning and my access to research, the neurological research that's been coming out of international studies is that human brains only become reading brains one way, whether they are born at that precocious level, whether they are born with a challenge brain like our children with dyslexia. All brains become reading brains in the same way. What they need to learn is the same. The speed with which they learn it, the ease with which they learn it differs tremendously. Some of that is affected by, as Mark says, the cultural differences. The language that they're speaking at home makes it easier or harder to acquire these things. But these are essentially, I mean, this is the simple view, but these are the components of what needs to be taught. And on page 130 in the book, effective reading instruction must help develop all these skills from both of these areas, that language comprehension and decoding, and it must happen simultaneously. There are hierarchies of skills. You're not going to be a fluent reader of text until you have mastered some of the prerequisite skills for that. But we don't develops children's language or literacy comprehension first, and then start doing phonemic awareness, and then phonics, and then vocabulary. We're doing many of these things simultaneously. We have to continuously throughout their developmental career, stimulating all of those things and developing them, paying attention that there is a sequence of some of those skills where they are in fact foundational, and then we build on that. When we're talking about word identification, I turn to David Kilpatrick's work in the book on page 134 and talk about his organization of the development of word identification skills across 3 levels. There are definitely more sophisticated ways of looking at this. The work that Jean Chall has done, the work of Linnea Airy of talking about phases and stages of development. But I really appreciate, especially when I was thinking about writing this book for educators who may just be beginning to learn about dyslexia, and parents, to keep it as simple as possible. And we look at Chall and Airy and Kilpatrick, at least at this early stage of word development. They're all saying the same thing, that we need at first to help our children identify their letter names and letter sounds. If you are a devotee of the work of Tim Shanahan, his most recent blog addressed a question from a teacher about this. Should we teach letter names first or teach letter sounds first? And Tim reviewed the research and said there really isn't research that says one or the other. So, and it would depend, his answer was very nuanced. He talked about it depends on where the child comes. If they come already knowing their letter names, then we can dive right into letter sounds. Some children come without having learned the alphabet and some of those prerequisite skills, and we might try to jumpstart what they're learning and do both at the same time. But we need to take our students to level 2, which is applying those letter sounds to decoding words, level 2 in Kilpatrick's framework, and then taking all children to level 3, where they are able, because of the foundations that have been laid, able to start orthographically mapping or anchoring the sequence of letters, the letter sequence in words, so that words become sight words, and talk about Scher's theory of self-teaching or statistical learning, as Seidenberg and others refer to it, discussed on pages 148 and 149, that nearly magical thing that happens when it clicks and it all comes together. And with the right foundational skills, children can start acquiring sight words after 1 to 4 exposures. It's just, we want to get all of our children there. So thinking about those levels visually, going back to Scarborough's rope, we could imagine kindergarten and grade 1 being this stage for our neurotypical children, that they develop these initial skills, start weaving them together in kindergarten and first grade. Later in first grade and early second grade, they're really starting to weave all these skills together. That would be the level 2 reading, and level 3 by about mid second grade and on, and continuing, that's the arrow there, are children who are on track, our neurotypical children. They are level 3 readers, sometimes earlier than second grade, if we think of Nancy Young's rope, and sometimes right around mid-second grade that begins to happen. But of course, we're here for this book study to talk about the children who are not neurotypical, who don't just move through those levels at the expected grade level. and may in fact spend many years at this stage of reading. Still developing those foundational skills, still building strong phonological, phonemic proficiency, still learning the alphabetic principle and breaking the code, still struggling with that orthographic mapping of creating sight words. Many pages in the book, as you can see, pages 135 to 152 devoted to teaching specifics around the all-important phonological and phonemic awareness, which is a key challenge for our learners with dyslexia. It's what the International Dyslexia Association says is what we've come to understand is the causal factor, or why we label children as having dyslexia, is because of a particular challenge in learning, developing that phonological and phonemic awareness. Phonics and decoding, several pages on that. And we want to be sure, and I talk in the book about teaching sounds correctly. We've had some recent evidence to inform our understanding about this in terms of making sure that teachers understand that it's beneficial to students to pronounce the sounds and model the sounds and have the children produce the sounds as continuant sounds or continuous sounds, rather than taking the word mom and going m or ah, having them continuously pronounced so that they are, from the beginning, the auditory aspect of blending the sounds together. Mom. Modeling it that way, having the children pronounce it that way, and practice it that way. And then there's how we say the sounds, but then also the actual pronunciation of the sound, making sure that we're not adding, modeling or allowing the students to add that extra schwa sound to the end of sounds, m or d or f. And that's important because of we want to use those sounds to decode words, to blend words, to be able to segment words into sounds so that we can write them correctly and identify them correctly. So from the very beginning, and when I visit classrooms, I'm often hearing sounds pronounced incorrectly, either with that extra sound, the addition of schwa sound, or pausing between the sounds, or repeating sounds. Just recently, I watched a teacher teach a virtual lesson, and she was teaching vowel sounds as repeated sounds. So she would show the letter I and teach, she was modeling that I says I, I, I. And I thought, yeah, no, it doesn't. Let's use that research understanding we have that it should be modeled as this letter I makes the I sound. Sight words, which we understand to be word recognition at the personal level. A sight word is not a word is not a sight word by category. A word is a sight word when an individual reader has orthographically mapped it into their memory, and all that is needed to have success for that. We do need language comprehension, we need phonological awareness and proficiency, and we need those decoding skills to be able to get to that point. Reading fluency covered in this book in a couple of pages, and here's a little shameless self-promotion, advertising another book that I wrote, this one in collaboration with the wonderful Deb Glazer. I hope you know her work. She has been involved with letters training for many decades. She is the creator, author, genius behind the wonderful top 10 tools for reading teachers' professional development work. And before she did that, I enticed her to collaborate with me on a book. The whole book is focused on reading fluency, defining it, assessing it, and teaching it. And then we spend some time talking about teaching across the grades on pages 153 to 156, what should be happening at each grade and what needs to happen developmentally and the order of that work. A few pages talking about that. And the chart from 165 from the book, another chart to take the big ideas that I've shared in the book about what needs to be taught and use that as a checklist for your own teaching, your school's teaching, your district's teaching, where your students are receiving your own children are receiving instruction. I hope that's helpful to you. And I've included a PDF of this chart, a little bit easier to use than the one in the book. Several pages at the back of the book, once you leave chapter 5, are on recommended resources. The pages of these, there are so many wonderful organizations, places where you can access research, places where you can access collaborative support from other teachers and other parents. So these are a few that I find myself recommending a lot from the pages of recommendations I make. And again, though, I didn't get everything in the book, and I keep learning things and accessing things. So not in the book is the wonderful resource at the University of Florida that they call the UFly. The virtual teaching resource hub is one of the things they've included, but they have just so many tongue-tied here thinking about the resources that they have. I did not include this in the book. I will in the future, and I strongly recommend, if you haven't discovered their amazing resources, that you take a look at that. So here's my next place to take a brief pause and answer some questions before we wrap up this evening.
There was one, oh, sorry, Katie, go right ahead.
Yeah, there was one asked right after we closed our last session in the
Sure.
Q&A.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about getting classroom teachers trained to deliver comprehensive, systematic, explicit, and intensive instruction rather than have students being pulled out by a trained specialist to deliver intervention?
Well, in the best world that we could imagine, all teachers would have the knowledge that we're talking about. Teachers would know how to identify comprehensive instruction and why that's important. They would know how to why to use systematic instruction and how to teach explicitly using multimodality and diagnostic teachers. They would know that, the classroom teachers would. And then I don't want to put any reading teachers or reading specialists or academic language therapists or anybody out of business, because we need everything. We need the classroom teachers to address the needs of all children, and then we need extra support for some of our children. But how do we get those teachers to get that information? This is the work that many of us are doing with the Reading League, making sure that the fabulous information that we have learned over the last few years that we're calling the science of reading is accessible to all teachers, specialists and classroom teachers, and very importantly, administrators who lead our work. I am a strong advocate of none of us learned everything we needed to learn in college, and continuing to learn. I have already mentioned Deb Glazer's wonderful series of professional development tools called the Reading Teacher's Top 10 Tools. I just think it's an amazing way for teachers in an inexpensive and highly supportive way to learn some of this information that they may not have. Letters is another, it's been around for a long time, wonderful, really deep training for teachers and specialists and administrators around comprehensive structured literacy and best practices in instruction. And there are growing numbers of universities that are doing training, much of which is available online. I'm thinking specifically of Mount St. Joseph doing trainings this way. The Ames Academy is doing that kind of work. CORE in California is doing that kind of work. Joan Sedita at Keys to Literacy is doing that kind of work. The information is out there, it's accessible, and we just want to wrap our arms around teachers and make sure that we support them for getting this information. But we're going to need classroom teachers to do this, and we're still going to need specialists to provide more support for our children.
So here's a very specific question. What procedure do you recommend for fluency practice in a whole class format? Does repeated reading procedures support fluency skills in a whole class setting?
Let me first go back to say, talk about that word differentiated. And what pops into my head is Nancy Young's wonderful ladder. And we may not have the same proportion of children represented in a classroom that Nancy has on her ladder, but almost always in classrooms, we're going to have children who are at or above expected level already. We're going to have children who are moving along at the expected rate in acquiring skills, and we're going to have the children who are going to need a lot more support to get there. So given that, there are lots of things that we can do in a classroom that won't bore those children. We've already talked tonight, somebody asked a question about a child getting bored. We don't want to bore those children who are doing quite well, and we don't want to intimidate or make overly challenging the work at the bottom. So one of the things we want to throw out right away is whole class round robin reading. We don't want to do that. That's not going to help anybody. It is a horrific experience for our struggling readers, and it is not beneficial for the children at the top. So one of the things that I talk about doing for replacing round robin reading is choral reading, have all the children follow along with the teacher, or repeat echo reading, or there's another term that I use for this, Anita Archer's, where the teacher reads and the children follow along. Close reading, yeah, close reading. The teacher's reading, the children are following the children, the students, because I've used this across all grade levels. And then every once in a while, the teacher stops and the children as a whole group say that next word. That can be modeling fluency. They're hearing fluent reading. They get a little, in choral reading, they get a little bit of practice of actually using their mouth and their lips. All of those things can be used whole class, and don't, and protect the kids at the top from getting bored, and protect the kids at the bottom from shame. Another technique I really like for a whole class, it does break kids up into partners, is the 6-minute solution. That is actually, I'll say that again more slowly, the 6-minute solution. It is a commercial program that has to be purchased, but it is basically a fluency. It's a fluency support. It's not a fluency intervention. There's not enough practice for children in the 6-minute solution, where partners of kids actually work literally for 6 minutes together, taking turns reading and listening to each other. But they only do 1 minute of reading each in that 6 minutes. But it's a lovely thing to do in a whole class, where we carefully structure the children who are doing that. So throw out round robin for whole class instruction, I beg you, and try some of those other things. Repeated reading is a wonderful methodology, but it rarely do enough practice in whole class to make it sufficiently beneficial.
There was also kind of a general question, maybe you can address this, some concern with a finding in schools that schools believe that by the end of 3rd grade, kids should be able to read proficiently.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens to those who don't read proficiently by the end of 3rd grade? And I think some of these people have been listening to Julie Washington in the Ohio symposium, or
Oh, yes.
what it was called this week, and she was making that point also. So I wonder if you could just speak to that briefly.
Sure, I will. And unfortunately, that will be our last question for tonight. I encourage you to contact me outside of this session or attend the last one that we're going to be talking about. But yes, it's lovely when children move along through the levels or phases or stages of development and at expected rates and are really readers by grade 3. That's where all that self-teaching and wonderful magical stuff starts to happen. Although there's much left to continue to teach even the children at the top of the ladder in those upper grades. We want to continue to develop their vocabulary, reading increasingly complex text, complex in terms of structure and content. We want children to deepen and expand their knowledge of morphology, which really kind of starts in a real deep way at 3rd grade. But what we must help people understand is just because many children are developed readers by 3rd grade, many of our students are not. And it is a huge battle. It is something we need to continue to help with the best data possible. I think if we're really monitoring children's progress, not just watching them move through levels of materials, but monitoring their progress using tools such as oral reading fluency and those kinds of things, we can see children not making the progress that we want them to make. Yes, and I share that concern with Julie Washington. So I'm going to remind you, as Mary and Katie did at the beginning of our session, that we have, they're going to be providing some opportunity for some follow-up next week. The parent group and the educator group, as Mary said, they're not, we kind of designated these groups, but they're not exclusive. And I know many of us parents are also educators. So we hope you can come to one or both of those if you want to spend the time. And then our final session, Tuesday evening again, the 23rd, same time, same place. No particular agenda that night. Although I might have a surprise or two for you that evening just to entice you to join us. But that will really be an opportunity for some more conversation and some specific questions that I don't get a chance to answer for you in this particular setting. So thank you all so very much. If you haven't connected with me on Twitter, I hope you will do that. Thanks to Mary and Katie and all the people supporting our work here tonight. Bless you all for the work that you do. Thank you from me, from my daughter, Lizzie. And I hope to see you one last time on February 23rd and enjoy your discussion sessions. So good night, everybody.
Good night.